We're talking this evening about one of the faculties, maybe the faculty that makes us human, the power of language. Our guest is Steve Pinker. Steve, you're a brain scientist at MIT. You've written this immensely entertaining book on why you and I and Yogi Berra talk the way we do. The title is The Language Instinct, and the argument, as I take it, amid all the jokes, is that language is not out there in dictionaries and in rules of grammar. It's somewhere in here in the DNA of the human species. I want to see if I can catch you sort of off second base for starters. You dedicate the book to Harry and Rosalind Pinker, I presume your parents, and you say, who gave me language. And yet the whole argument of the book is that we don't learn language by imitation. We don't get it from our parents. We'd have it anyway. Is there an inconsistency there? Or do you mean they gave you the DNA?
I meant it in both senses. They gave me language by giving me their DNA. They also gave me English by talking to me when I grew up. So it was intentionally intended to...
But you argue that we don't get language from our caregivers.
We do get English from our caregivers if we grow up in a society that speaks English, just as if any one of us was brought up in Japan, we'd end up speaking Japanese. But the basic logic of language, the fact that it's built out of nouns and verbs and phrases and auxiliaries and all the rest, that I think comes from the fact that we have human brains, that the human brain was designed for language. But the details of particular languages obviously depends on what country you happen to be brought up in.
You mean that the human brain was designed for language the way the spider's brain was designed for web spinning?
Exactly right. I think that we just can't help it, that children can't help but learn, or in fact, a better way of putting it is children can't help but reinvent a language every generation.
Explain exactly the force of that instinct argument. I mean, what are the alternative explanations of language?
Well, language could be like some kind of cultural invention, like driving or chess or how the government works or how to tell time, something that was invented at some point in history that was passed down from thereafter and acquired by some general ability to learn. And I think language is different from that. I think that language wasn't invented by some genius. It wasn't acquired in the same way that we learn, say, how to tell time, or even how we learn to read. The ability to speak and understand is something that every human society always has had, that every normal child develops spontaneously without needing lessons, and that has pretty much a uniform degree of complexity across all societies and across all individuals.
If you put two spiders on a desert island, they would start spinning webs, presumably. If you put two babies without parents to teach them or without caregivers to imitate, would they start making a language?
Well, this is a question that people have been wondering about for millennia, because there have been a lot of apocryphal stories about doing that experiment, bringing up two babies in a hut tended by a deaf-mute shepherd, for example, and then the kings would argue over whose language would be the one that the children would spontaneously invent. Would it be Phrygian?
What's your theory?
Would it be Hebrew? I don't know if two is enough, but we do know that if you had a group of kids, I'd be willing to bet that they would invent a language. The closest thing that we have, aside from these fantasies, in terms of what we know about, the case of deaf children is probably the best example. When a group of deaf children are together and they, of course, can't acquire the spoken language from people around them, but in every case a sign language will arise pretty much spontaneously in one generation, and it'll be the sign languages of the deaf have all the grammatical complexity of a spoken language. They're just as expressive. They're built out of the same kinds of grammatical machinery, such as nouns and verbs and phrases and agreement and so on. And we know that this springs from the minds of children.
What does that tell you about human nature?
Well, it would certainly say that the human brain is not just an all-purpose, multi-purpose learning device capable of acquiring anything, because children are grammatical geniuses in a sense. A 3-year-old basically commands most of the grammar of spoken English, and it's at an age in which the child can't do much else. I mean, they wouldn't be able to play chess, we don't let them vote, we don't let them drive, but here they are speaking far better than the most sophisticated computer language system that anyone has ever come up with.
I want to be sure that in the big picture we don't give short shrift to the delight of this book. And you answer a lot of questions like why we say Wade Boggs flied out to center field rather than flew out to center field. You talk about, one Walkman and another Walkman make two
Walkmans,
not walk persons, not walk people. You also raise an interesting question as to why we describe a kitchen as spick and span, not span and spick. Why riff raff, not raff riff? Why mish mash, flim flam, chit chat, tit for tat, knick knack, zig zag, sing song, never song sing, never dong ding, never kong king, never cross Chris. You want to explain that?
Okay, I'll start with the second one. No one really knows why it works this way, but the vowels for which the tongue is high in the mouth and to the front always come before the vowels where the tongue is low in the mouth and to the back. So it's I, ah, e, ah, and so on, never vice versa. Seesaw, not saw, see. It may have something to do with the sort of symbolic value of vowels, that small vowels where the tongue is high into the front of the mouth remind people of small things like mice that squeak, and when the tongue is in the back of the mouth, it makes a big cavity in the mouth that reminds people of big things like elephants roar, or we have the little tweeter in a speaker and the big woofer. Or if you tweak something, you make a tiny little adjustment to it, but when you frob something, in the slang of computer programmers, you're really whacking it. And
you also, at another point, you talk about why we say razzle dazzle instead of dazzle razzle. Why super duper, not duper super. Helter skelter, harem scarum, hocus pocus, willy nilly, holly gully, roly poly, holy moly, herky jerky, etc. Explain that.
The more your tongue blocks the airflow, the later in the word that consonant goes. So herky jerky, h, you're just creating a little bit of friction with your tongue. J, you're stopping up the air for a second and then letting it release out. And the consonant where you're obstructing the air less comes before the consonant where you're obstructing the air more.
Does that apply to languages other than English?
Yes, it applies to lots of languages. There are a few ones that reverse it consistently across the board. Like Turkish, goes the other way, but it goes the other way for every word in the language, not just for one or two. So in a way, it's almost like they've just flipped the switch or reversed the wires. But aside from that, the law works perfectly. I
wonder, is there a connection here to another considerable mystery in your book, which is why MIT and lots of other smart places have not been able to invent so far a mechanical stenographer, a machine that can take human speech and reduce it reliably to a text?
It's an extremely difficult engineering problem. It's one that we're not aware of because speech is so effortless to us. I mean, we don't realize that, for one thing, there aren't any little silences in between the words the way there are white spaces in between words in print. If you were to look at a spectrogram of someone's speech, you couldn't tell where one word ended and the other one began. And that's what's behind all kinds of wordplay like mares-y-dotes and does-y-dotes, or mishearings like the character on Hill Street Blues who said, I only have 3 words to say to you: statue, Tory, rape.
Samuel Goldwyn said, I'll answer that in 2 words: impossible.
Right, same thing, exactly. So when you have a mechanical stenographer, it's got to cope with the fact that it doesn't know where one word ends and the other begins. Also, one thing we don't realize, so we don't appreciate how hard a problem it is that the consonant or vowel is pronounced very differently depending on its neighbors. We don't realize that when we say something like Cape Cod, even though we spell those 2 C's the same, and we think that we're giving the same sound both times, in one case, the tongue is in the front of the mouth, Cape. In the other case, it's in the back, cod. If you say it to yourself over again, Cape Cod, you can begin to train yourself to hear the difference, but the brain just compensates automatically. But for the poor computer, getting sound in from a microphone, those 2 k sounds are completely different, and the computer has to be programmed in order to do the kind of compensation that our brain does automatically.
Is there a sort of a philosophical point there, or will computers close that gap?
I think they might close that gap. If there is a philosophical point, it's just that the human brain is much more complicated than we realize, because the human brain is designed to hide its complexity from us. It's kind of, I think the way the brain works is largely the way digestion works. It's a very complicated process, but we don't actually think of which stomach acid we release at what point. It happens without our having to think about it. And a lot of the mental abilities that we take for granted, like holding a conversation, involve much more complex processes that are also hidden from consciousness. So I think the person in the street is apt to underestimate what a miracle just everyday abilities like walking across the street or recognizing a friend are, because they work so well and so unconsciously.
I had a general question about language that's not exactly in your book, but you're the guy to answer it. 20 years ago or so, it was a kind of a cliche of general conversation that television was going to reduce all American language to the same tone, that regional accents would disappear, would all end up sounding like Walter Cronkite. Not only that hasn't happened, it just seems to me, in fact, quite the contrary. There's a huge new input of computer language, MTV language, even Olympic language. I was noticing today the use of the word medal as a verb. The United States medaled twice today. Mm-hmm. You know, Nancy Kerrigan, she didn't gold, but she silvered. And especially in black language, I was in New York the other day, overhearing black kids talk, they sound more different than they did 10 years ago, and more different than any other segment that I can think of that's sort of mainstream in this society. How do you explain the fact that language doesn't get homogenized, even by something as powerful as television?
For one thing, people like to sound different. People like to be cool. And one way of being cool is to talk in a way that the in-crowd understands, but that the people outside your circle don't understand. So there's always going to be a temptation to try to invent your own slang just to preserve a sense of cool.
And it works too. I mean, cool language is status.
And then what happens is that as it begins to be taken over by the mainstream, it's no longer cool, and the standard language then benefits by having a richer vocabulary, and then the various subcultures have to go on and invent new terms to keep that sense of specialness.
What do you judge by that? I mean, to me, it's another the language of black teenagers seems to me somehow connected to their prominence in sports, in music, but also in fashion magazines and whatnot. It seems to me you at least could make an argument that it's evidence of a vital and growing role of black kids in this society, despite all the counterindications and maybe the handicaps they're under.
Absolutely. And in fact, verbal virtuosity has always been an important part of African American culture. And it's for at least 50 years, a lot of the words that have enriched standard English originally came from black English. In fact, in all languages, the growth of vocabulary often comes from subcultures, and after a while you tend to forget where the words come from, and when you hear new slang, you're horrified that this represents some decline of the language, not realizing that a lot of the words that we use every day were in their own time slang that horrified the experts. Things like the word fun or banter or mob or sham were all decried as horrible corruptions in their time. The language is going down the tubes, they would have said if they had that idiom. But here we are a couple of hundred years later, we've absorbed those words, we're still making ourselves understood, and the new words that give people the creeps. Now, some of them will pass away, but some of them will be absorbed, and in 100 years from now, people will wonder what all the fuss is about them.
What are your favorite sources of new language? How do you tune in on it?
My favorite kind of new language is verbs that come from nouns. You gave the example of to meddle. And the reason I like them, for one thing, it's one of the things that horrifies the so-called guardians of the language.
We'll get to them, yeah.
Isn't it a crime that people are using words like parenting and to impact and meddling, and we're going to task this.
Can I input you on that?
We're going to input it. There are a couple of nice things about the phenomenon. One of them is that it's been going on for hundreds of years, and it's one of the things that makes English English. I mean, if you compare English to other languages, the first thing that a linguist will say is English loves to turn nouns into verbs. And I've estimated that about a fifth of all our verb vocabulary originally came from nouns. After a while, they become unexceptionable and we don't notice. But if you think of a word like to shoulder the burden, that's from the noun shoulder. To elbow your way in, that's from the noun elbow, and so on. The reason that I like them is that it shows how sophisticated the mental grammar of a person in the street is, much more sophisticated than the grammarians give them credit for, and much more sophisticated than what you'll actually find in the style manuals. You referred earlier to the baseball term to fly out, whose past tense is flied out. No mere mortal has ever flown out to center field. And if you look that up in a grammar book, why in baseball do you say flied out? Or why in hockey, if Nevin Marquardt clobbers Gretzky with a hockey stick, why do we say that he high-sticked Gretzky, not he high-stuck Gretzky?
Right.
Why in Toronto is there a team called the Maple Leafs and not the Maple Leaves? Or in Florida, the Marlins and not the Marlin? There's actually a simple explanation that none of the grammar book writers have discovered, which is that whenever you change the grammatical category or part of speech of a word, then it always goes from irregular to regular. So to fly out, if you're among the baseball cognoscenti, means to hit a fly. It doesn't mean to flap your wings and proceed through the air. So to fly out is a verb that comes from the noun fly, a fly or a pop fly. A noun can't have a past tense, so it can't have an irregular past tense. Therefore, you forget about flew and flown, and you apply the all-purpose rule add ed to form the past tense. Now this is something that has recently been discovered by linguists, but no one actually reasons out consciously. They just automatically do it. It wouldn't occur to anyone to say he high-stuck the goalie or he broke the car instead of he braked the car. Again, it's a verb from a noun, the brakes.
I was very glad to see in your book that you sort of go to war against the language mavens, the policeman, which has actually several points in it that I hope we get to. Most notably, the best of them all, Bill Safire in the New York Times. I would have said that what's wrong with Safire is that he comes at the whole subject really as a one-time Nixon speechwriter and as an advertising person with a fundamentally sales interest in the use of words. You hack him up, though, for being a kind of a fuss budget. Explain that. What's wrong with certain fundamental rules like don't split infinitives?
Well, a lot of those rules have no reason for being. I mean, people have the wrong idea if they think that there's a proper way of speaking English that was actually legislated at some point, or that where there are some official rules. It's really all the sort of whims of the people who put together the grammar books, and a lot of the reasons for outlawing basic constructions that everyone uses were kind of silly to begin with, like that's not the way it's done in Latin, so it shouldn't be done in English either, because Latin is the perfect language and English should aspire to be as logical as Latin was.
What if not splitting infinitives is a kind of code of, I hate to say an elite, but of a class that students are aspiring to?
Well, the fact that there is a standard language is it's not a terrible thing. I mean, for the same reason that there should be a standard side of the road that everyone drives on, or a standard voltage that comes out of the wall when you plug in your appliance. But it's different from saying that when people don't conform to that, they're speaking ungrammatically. If someone says, I can't get no satisfaction, instead of, I can't get any satisfaction, that they're speaking in fractured syntax. Or if someone says, hopefully the Red Sox will win this year, that they're committing some barbarism.
Grades in my year, I got to tell you. Grades are bad. In fact, I taught writing at MIT, and I used to give the kids there 5 rules by which you could sort of pass for a Harvard person. 1, don't misuse hopefully, don't split infinitives, don't end a sentence with a preposition, don't use like as a conjunction, and learn how to spell accommodate. 5 rules, and the world will take you for a civilized person. I still don't know what's wrong with that.
Well, it shows some part of the dynamic by which these rules survive, and I must admit I'm as guilty of this as anyone. I mean, my students will get abuse heaped on them if they misplace a semicolon. But part of it is we feel so proud of ourselves that we went to the effort to learn these rules. It just seems like a sign of moral weakness for the younger generation not to do it, even if the rules don't make much sense, and even if in a lot of cases they actually impede clear communication and good writing. And one thing that you immediately see when you look at these rules is that they've been violated by all the great writers of English, and that a lot of them really have no basis in tradition or in logic. They just get perpetuated, kind of like college fraternity hazing. Like, I had to go through with it. Why should
I disagree with you in part, but I want to move on to another branch of the language police. There's another whole squadron of language police out there who are monitoring the politically correct dictionary at least on the premise that language forms action, and that if we talk about nuking people, or we are sort of promoting nuclear brinksmanship among nations or something. Does that kind of language precede and condition action, or is there a conditioning thought before the language that's even more important in your view?
Yeah, a lot of the panic over politically correct language comes from the idea that we think in words and that our attitudes are insidiously shaped by the language that we use. And that's why that you have these often very draconian style sheets that say you can't use Dutch treat because that'll foster discrimination against the Dutch and so on. I do think that it's exaggerated. I think that people recognize euphemism when they see it. And the Monty Python sketch about the parrot that's gone to meet its maker sort of trades on that humor. The people aren't fooled by euphemism.
Do you want to quote it?
This parrot is no more. This is a late parrot. It has rung down the curtain and joined the celestial choir. So I don't think people are brainwashed. And so I think that people can calm down. You're not going to have a generation of sexists if people say everyone return to his seat instead of each person return to his or her seat. I think there are subtle misuses of language by politicians and bureaucracies as kind of a clever form of lying. If you refer to something as revenue enhancement when you mean taxes, or collateral damage when you mean people bombed to death, then it's a way of fooling people. It's not a way of brainwashing people, but it is a clever way of lying. And I think a lot of the discussion that tries to debunk bafflegab is valuable, not because it's kind of a sort of mental hygiene, but it's valuable as a way of exposing lying.
In what time we have, 4 or 5 minutes, I want to touch on one of the larger arguments in your book, and it involves the Tower of Babel, which always shows up in any real discussion about language. Your argument is that language is a universal and very peculiarly human instinct, which is exactly the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis, that God created human beings with a single language, and at some point when they seemed to be getting out of hand, or maybe a threat to the Lord, he came down and sort of confused them in a babel of different speech. But that underlying all the diversity of human languages, thousands of them, is a single key.
Yeah.
I'd love you to talk about the implications for you of going back to a kind of neo-creationism in language.
Well, it is impressive when you look at languages from anywhere in the world that they are all about as complicated in terms of their grammar. There's no such thing as a primitive language or a Stone Age language. Often you go to the so-called primitive peoples and they have a grammar that's fantastically complex, that has these wonderful distinctions that I often wish we could use in English. Also, the languages all over the world seem to be built out of the same machinery. I mean, on the one hand, you might be impressed by the differences between languages. Like in Japanese, you put the object before the verb, and in English, you put the verb before the object. But the remarkable thing is that you can find things like verbs and objects in a language as distant from English as Japanese to begin with. So it suggests that the basic software that in people's heads that allows them to speak and understand is the same across the entire species. And in a sense, all the world's 4,000 to 5,000 languages are almost like dialects of one language.
Yeah.
And that gives you a different view of the human species, I think.
Exactly. And you also hypothesized at the end that there could be other instincts that, given time and enough paper to write the books, you could argue are equally distinctively human. Mm-hmm. It sounds to me, not knowing your field very well, as if there's a bit of a revolution implied in social sciences by this notion that the human being, far from being a kind of a manipulable blob of protoplasm that can be educated to anything and is enormously differentiated by his cultures, is in fact one highly developed piece of machinery that's the same the world around.
Yeah.
Can you explain the revolution that's implied in that general picture?
Yeah. In a lot of social science, there are two assumptions that kind of reinforce each other. From anthropology, there's the idea that cultures can vary from each other arbitrarily, the same way it used to be thought that languages could vary from each other arbitrarily, that no matter what outlandish idea you have about how people could behave, there's some exotic society out there where the people behave that way. And the idea from psychology that there's a multi-purpose general learning ability, and that's all that there is in the mind. And I think just as in the case of language, we discover that beneath the surface there's a common logic underneath all the world languages. Recently, some anthropologists have reopened the annals of ethnography and have found that there are universal patterns of culture across all the thousands of cultures that have been documented. I mean, we can be impressed by the differences the same way we're impressed by the difference between English and Japanese.
But is it fair to see a kind of, forgive me, but a sort of Judeo-Christian orthodoxy creeping back into our understanding of what a human being is in this tendency in social science that you're writing about?
Well, I don't know if I'd put it that way, but I think that a lot of the emotion that comes from arguments about language and mind do have a kind of ethical, political, almost religious significance. That is, if the mind has some kind of structure built in universally, does this set limits on the best that we can hope for the human species? Is warfare inevitable? Are we designed to rape and murder? And if you think of the mind as a blank slate, for some people that gives you hope that you can design a society where everything that's evil about humans can be eliminated.
Steve, your book gives me hope. Unfortunately, our time is up, but I thank you very much. Fascinating half hour, fascinating book. Thank you, Steve Pinker.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.